afternoon, good evening. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Gruyter Authors in Conversation series. My name is Julia Brauch, and I've been an editor in the field of Jewish studies for many years. I would like to introduce Lihi Ben Shitrit and Dahlia Scheindlin and say a few words about their books. When Lihi brought this book to me last December, following October 7th and the subsequent war in Gaza, the scholarly debate on Israel and anti-Semitism had already become highly charged with emotion. You may imagine that this also affects publishing in Jewish studies. As I read the proposal, it gradually became clear to me that I was dealing with an impressive statement against this atmosphere of hatred and delegitimization of the other side. Without exaggeration, one can say that the volume presents a compelling case for a non-fundamentalist, multi-voice discourse. It opens up future horizons at a moment when radical positions clash violently. So this is why we are really proud to have Lihi's volume in our program. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce Lihi Ben Shitrit, editor of the Gates of Gaza. Lihi is the director of the Taub Center for Israel Studies and the Henry Taub Associate Professor of Israel Studies at NYU. She's also an associate professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. She has been dealing with the radical and religious right in Israel for many years, and she engages with broader audiences through opinion pieces and articles like the most recent one in the foreword. In addition to the book we are discussing today, she's also the author of two other books, Righteous Transgressions, Women's Activism on the Israeli and Palestinian Religious Right, which you also find on the Gruyter homepage, and Women and the Holy City, the struggle over Jerusalem's sacred space. So now I'm also pleased to introduce Dahlia Scheindlin, author of The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, Promise Unfulfilled. Dahlia is a political scientist with a PhD from Tel Aviv University, a public opinion expert, and a political consultant. In this capacity, she has advised 9 national election campaigns in Israel since 1999. She's a policy fellow at the Century Foundation, a regular columnist at Haaretz, and a foreign affairs analyst on the BBC television program Context. She also has co-hosted several podcasts, including the Tel Aviv Review of Books and Election Overdose. Dahlia is originally from the US and moved to Israel in 1997. Her book, The Crooked Timber of Democracy in Israel, came out last fall and was published in our social science portfolio in the series Democracy in Times of Upheaval. It offers a brilliant and insightful analysis of the problems facing Israeli democracy within its historical context. While the occupation is a primary concern, the book identifies democratic deficits that extend much further back. It begins with pre-state Zionism in the late 19th century and continues through the present. My favorite sentence in her book appears twice, once at the beginning and once at the end. The sentence reads as follows: Israel is democratic enough to know just how undemocratic it is. So this seems to be a critical but still optimistic guiding principle to study Israel's problems with democracy. In her analysis, Dahlia explicitly treats Israel like any other state and asserts Zionism is not an obstacle to analyzing democracy. Her focus is on Israel's democratic deficits in its historic context, and not on an inherent incompatibility between Zionism and democracy. Both Lihi and Dahlia offer refreshing new critical perspectives on Israel, democracy, and the conflict. And I'm now very much looking forward to their conversation. So Lihi and Dahlia, thanks so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you. Thank you. It's an honor to be doing this. It's an honor to have my book published by De Gruyter, and especially an honor to be in conversation with Lihi. Lihi and I go pretty far back. In fact, I think we first virtually met when I reviewed your book, Righteous Transgressions, which I still recommend to people to this day, because I do think it is very insightful. There are numerous insights that are valuable for helping to understand some of the forces that we see on the ground here. And I know that this current book will be as well. The book is almost dizzying in its span, so many authors, so many articles. I don't want people to be intimidated because the articles are short, readable narrative, even though it is an academic book, but it's also a very accessible book. And there's such a wealth of insights. I want to ask you, how did you see the through line between the various people that you invited to contribute to this book? I mean, what are the common thematic elements you were looking for? I mean, I know you organized the sections into themes, but I mean, what did you have in mind when you thought, I'm going to ask this person to contribute? I want to ask if I can use this article. What binds these different contributions and essays about the war on October 7th?
That's an excellent question. And first, also, I want to thank the Gruyter. I want to thank Julia, Heather, and Dahlia for organizing this event. I'm very honored and happy to be with you and with the audience that is attending. I'll say the book developed quite organically, and it was very different from an academic book where you've done research for years and then you spent years organizing your data and then years organizing the structure of your book. It really came from a place of, I think, shock and almost paralysis after October 7. And I think a lot of people can relate to that. October 7 was completely unexpected, and it took me a long time to, I think, be able to think again, because I was overcome with emotions. And again, I think everyone have. And as we moved from October 7 to the build-up towards the war in Gaza and then the war in Gaza, I think events were unrelenting, right? Events were unrelenting. It didn't give a lot of space for reflection and also the discourses that were developing around the war and October 7 in Israel, in the United States, where I'm placed, were also not giving much space for critical reflection. It was people, taking positions. It was binaries being constructed immediately, and even people that you'd think could hold, complicated notion of the situation on the ground in Israel and Palestine also seemed to feel like they have to choose a side, uncompromisingly choose a side and stick to it. So out of that paralysis and confusion and shock, I just started reaching out to people that either I was reading or that I knew from before that I hoped were wise enough and still holding on to their critical faculties to offer me some guidance on how to think about what's happening. How did we get here? How did we even arrive at October 7, right? It was so shocking, but if we sit down and analyze it, the reasons, right? There's history that preceded it. How did it happen? And then what are people feeling on the ground? What are people experiencing? And then for me, the most important thing was, where do we go from here, right? How do we come out of the situation we are in? And hope. Do we have hope? And where do we find this hope? So I reached out to a lot of people, more than the people that are in the book. So I think the book has about 25 contributors. I reached out to more. And I'm happy to say that there are a lot of people that, were still able to think critically and to analyze what's happening, and also to deal with their own emotions and shock and pain and trauma in a way that I find constructive. There are more people out there than just the contributors of the book, but some of them were unavailable. Some of them didn't feel like it was time to write. They were not ready to write. They were thinking, they were still processing, but not writing. So I reached out to many, many people, and I really didn't give a lot of guidance, right? I just trusted these voices, and I want to know, what are they thinking? what are they thinking right now? So I left it very, very open, except that I did ask a lot of people to write about hope because I was desperate for hope. So the through line or the structure really came out of the pieces that people sent, right? And they were very different. They were very different in content. They were very different in register and genre. Some of them are very analytic and draw on people's academic expertise. And some of them are very, very personal and just talk about what people are experiencing right now and how they're processing the event. So I would say this is very different from my previous books that have a very, very clear plan. The plan really emerged inductively from the contributions that I received.
I was struck by what you said about the fact that up until you got the idea for this book, you said that the discourse was lining up so that everybody was had to choose a side. And I think, many of us have experienced this, but I think that what I've noticed about that choosing sides is that, and I assume this is what you mean, everybody felt like they had to choose the side of being on the side of Israel or the side of Palestine, as opposed to, and that of course at this moment carried with it being on the side of October 7th or being on the side of Israel's war. And it's almost like, to my mind, the through line, you tell me, and I just want to know if you think this is a good characterization, is that all the people you chose are on a particular side, but it's a side that cuts across Israel and Palestinians. And it's a side that says we believe in critical thinking, shared values, peaceful resolution to the conflict somehow, humanity, rather than the side that says solve everything with military force. Can there be two sides like that cut across the two people?
I think that's so important, and you're mentioning it, and it's true. And I should have mentioned it in my answer to you, that I felt so lonely at that point of time where I couldn't find around me people that can hold those two, how would I say, those two commitments that are actually the same commitment. It's, people think that if you support Israel right now, it seems like if you support Israel, you have to be against Palestinians, or if you support Palestinians, you have to be against Israel. But actually, Palestinians and Israelis' lives are so interdependent and intertwined that you can't have a zero-sum game, right? When one side loses and suffers, the other side also loses and suffers. When one side is not secure, the other side is not secure. But I didn't find a lot of people around me being able to see that, and that was it was a very, very lonely place. So I did reach out to people that I know either have connections in both communities, deep, deep connections of friendship, sometimes of family. And if they didn't, they still have the capacity for empathy. And I think that is actually one of the thing that, the only thing maybe that unites all the authors agree on, because they disagree on many things. The book shows many different perspectives, different positions, different ideological and political commitments as well. But I think that that idea of being able to see pain and hurt and trauma as a human condition that is experienced by Israelis and Palestinians, and empathy towards one does not mean disregard towards the pain of the other. So yeah, absolutely, you're completely right. I think that is the only thing, the only common ground between all the chapters.
Well, then let me be blunt. It seems like this book is populated by people who would be considered part of what we sometimes call the peace supporters, peace camp, left wing, for lack of a better term. And, it's interesting because the book is full of this universe of people. And so it feels like this is a little world into itself. But the reality shows, the reality is that in the region, it feels like a very, very tiny, limited, and often, persecuted community in a way, at least ideologically persecuted. Do you think that this book will, open up, open avenues for people to identify with these views, or do you think it's going to end up becoming something like a historic chronicle, a museum piece of these kinds of people?
Which it almost feels like it also felt like a history, like a chronicle, that I'm documenting things that people have been saying in the moment. And many of the chapters are from October, and and then a few weeks after October, and then November, but they're very, very fresh. I was worried, but there's a reason why this book is in English, right? And there's a reason why it's the audience are, I think, are probably mostly outside of Israel and Palestine. And that is because I saw that, as Israelis and Palestinians, of course, move to these, polar positions because they're experiencing a war that both of them are experiencing as existential. They really are. I mean, the feeling in Israel after October 7 was existential, catastrophe. And the feeling of Gaza, of course, is existential catastrophe. So the people that are living this reality, you have to have compassion and understanding why they might not be able to, think right now about the pain and trauma and difficulty of the other. But I saw the same kind of polarization happening outside of Israel and Palestine, right? In universities in the United States, in the public discourse in the United States, in Europe. And this book for me was almost like an offering, for people who are importing that polarization from Israel and Palestine, to see that there are other voices in Israel and Palestine that are offering a different vocabulary and different way of talking about it, and almost giving you here, and here I'm saying in the United States or in Europe, permission to speak critically without feeling like you're betraying the people that you care about, whether they're Israelis and Palestinians. So I think the audience is not Israelis and Palestinians. It's people that are looking into the conflict, and I'm asking them not to replicate the dynamic that exists in Israel and Palestine because people are engaged in what they feel is an existential war.
But you're asking them to replicate the dynamic of the book, which is sort of a critical, thoughtful, and empathetic engagement.
Exactly, but to say, and to be frank, this is Israeli citizens, so Palestinian and Jewish Israeli citizens, and the audience is probably more people who care about Israel abroad, people who care about Israel and finding themselves in a position where they feel almost obligated to support everything that the Israeli government does because they care about Israel. This is, in a way, permission to be critical also of the Israeli government based on authentic voices from Israel. And people that clearly care about Israel, love Israel, and their lives are affected by what's happening in Israel.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about the content of the book. I mean, I wish we had time to go through every single essay, but you do have it broken down into themes, how we got here, what's the experience of being here, and where do we go from here? Can you point, I mean, I'm just going to start with the one that interests me the most at this very moment. In another moment, I could choose any of the themes, but would you be able to point to one of the essays from the section that talks about where we go from here that you thought particularly resonated with you, or that you want people to have as their initial taste of this book before they all run out and buy it after our webinar?
Yeah. So I think that's the hardest. I mean, no, it's not. I'm not surprised that you're asking about that, because that's what is on everybody's mind, and it's the hardest. And for me, what was I don't think there were concrete policy suggestions in that section of where we go from here. I think the policy suggestions were in the how did we get here and what's happening on the ground, because each chapter in those section offers an intervention in a particular moment, explaining what's been done wrong, and also outlining, an alternative a path that could be taken now. So someone is writing on October 16th. This is what we need to do now. And then it's a kind of a sad chronicle, because you see every one of these suggestions for intervention is not heeded as the war unfolds, and we find ourselves in worse and worse and worse conditions. For me, the going forward is this idea of holding on to hope, and there are three chapters that are about hope. One is in search of generational hope, right, where Tanya Zion Waldax and Galit Cohen-Kedem talk about intergenerational trauma, and what are the tools to turn this inheritance of intergenerational trauma into intergenerational hope, like active work at transferring from one generation to another hope, as opposed to trauma. And then there is also a very powerful chapter by Merav Amir and Hagar Kotev, who talk about the breakdown in solidarity. They're scholars that have also been engaged in Palestinian solidarity activism, and they felt a huge break after October 7th when some of the people that they've worked side by side with were not able to acknowledge what happened on October 7th. We're not able, under any circumstances, to see Israelis as victims. And that was a huge, I mean, I think that's still something that the kind of the solidarity circles are dealing with. And they're trying to work through it. They're trying to work through it, acknowledging it, not hiding it, not being apologetic about it, taking it face on, and then how do we continue solidarity work in spite of what happened? So I think for me that potential for alliance, for actual alliance on the ground is something that defies, really defies the moment we're living in, but they're doing it, right? They're engaging in it, they're doing it, and I think that's the only way forward, right? To insist on solidarity, to insist on Arab and Jews, Israelis and Palestinians working together, talking to each other, listening to each other, seeing each other. That's the only way forward. Yeah.
Wonderful. I mean, one of the things I think we're all noticing about the conversations abroad, since you highlighted that this is in a way intended for the conversations abroad, is that at least one of the things that I think is striking, in addition to all of the very loud, shouting demonstrations, zero-sum narratives around this abroad, is the fact that so many students and academic communities are simply taking themselves out of the conversation. Beyond the shouting, I think the other response is, we're not going to touch this. We're not going to invite any speakers from Israel or Palestine. We're not going to talk about it. And you have student groups boycotting, from what I understand, in certain universities, anything to do with the issue. I mean, do you think that this book maybe can cut through some of the unwillingness to even address the issue, let alone cutting across those very, very, angry divisions of ideology?
I really hope so, but that is an open question, right? Because I'm sure that someone is going to look at this book and say, oh, this is all Israelis and Palestinian Israelis. Where are the people, where are the voices from Gaza? Where are the voices from the West Bank? So they would say they can call it Zionist propaganda, for example, even though the authors are all the way on the spectrum from liberal Zionist to anti-Zionist, with all sorts of definitions in the middle, non-Zionist, post-Zionist, or no definition. But some people can say, okay, because of the identity of the authors, I'm not going to even open it up. There could be people who say, this is critical of the Israeli government. So this is pro-Palestinian propaganda, right? So I think right now, I'm not sure people are doing a lot of reading and a lot of listening and a lot of challenging themselves and their positions or their almost knee-jerk reactions. But they read it, and you can tell me, because you're reading it, and you can tell me how you think. I do think that it presents a diversity of perspectives that all point in the direction of listening and speaking across disagreements. So I do hope people actually read it, but that is with books, you wrote a review of my first book, and there was a review of the book in a settler magazine, this far-right settler magazine, and they say, we didn't read the book, but we read the review, and we think that this book should be burnt. So, I mean, the hope is that people would read books, but it could be self-selection, where the people who actually pick up a book are the people who are already willing to push themselves. I do have to say that when conversations do happen, and I've been invited to speak in panels at universities together with Palestinian speakers, when those conversations happen and they're not boycotted, and the students come and they don't shut you down, and the administration allows to have that kind of conversation, they're really powerful. We had one in Sarah Lawrence. I spoke in a panel with a few people, and one of them was Saad Atshan, who's a Palestinian scholar. And you see that
I know Saad Atshan.
Yeah, he's incredible. But then it was a campus that was that was in turmoil, and we sat and we talked, and the students asked us difficult questions, and we disagree on some things, but they let us both speak. And you could see kind of a sigh of relief by everyone in the room.
Yeah.
Wow, we can have this conversation. We can talk like that. And then there was a standing ovation, right? So I feel like there is desire, but it's not happening enough. It's not happening enough, and I hope this book can be kind of one way of starting conversations like this.
Yeah. I mean, I personally, reading through some of the essays, I think in a way there is such a range of everything from policy to impressions to emotions to actual what can happen next. I mean, I feel like everybody will find themselves for whatever is concerning that person, whether it's again like an emotional solidarity or a policy analysis. I feel like everybody can find something in the different chapters in the book. I want to go back to your introduction to the book because
can I just add to that. So I think even something really hard, like the word genocide, right? So there are two chapters, and one is by David Kurtzmer, who's a international legal scholar who thinks what's happening is not a genocide. And then we have an article by Omer Bartov, who's an historian of the Holocaust, who say, I'm worried that it could become a genocide. So they don't agree on this, but we can talk about it. We can talk about it, and they both bring arguments, and they don't just shut the conversation because they have a disagreement. So I think really, and I have an article about this, the slogan from the river to the sea. Let's talk about it.
That's a very interesting one. I actually read that one.
Let's aggregate. Let's deal with it instead of running away from all of these things. Sorry.
Right. No, it's a great segue actually, because I'm going to ask what I think might be a tougher question, which relates to both of those articles you just, the debate between Omer Bartov and David Kurtzmer about whether what's happening is genocide. You wrote your introduction on October 31st. The essays came in, over the course of the months immediately following. And when I was reading the introduction, it was painful because you said, as of this moment, 8,000 people in Gaza have been killed. And of course, now we're up to 36,000. And, so things have gotten in many ways, well, just by definition, much worse because the war has gone on this long. And I guess I want to know, it seems to me October 31st seems quaint. Our emotions were absolutely intolerable then. And, in some ways we've become accustomed to this horrible feeling, but in some ways things are worse. How would you change? I mean, is there anything you feel differently about now in terms of your own, what you expressed in the introduction, that, that makes you feel different now? And I suppose I would have the same question with relation to some of the debates in the book.
I mean, that's a great question. And the introduction really came out of sleepless nights, right? I couldn't sleep during October, and I needed to help myself sleep. So I wrote, and it's very immediate. Like you can see, it's a very, very immediate kind of account. But I do feel like it still has value because there's still choices to be made, right? And it's almost always the same choices. Prisoners and hostages exchange deal or more war, right? Ceasefire and going towards a political vision of where we're going from here, or more war. I mean, all of these dilemmas are still there. They're still acute, and they're still being debated, right? And then the fact that you read something from October 31st that tells you, if you go towards more war, this is what is going to happen, and it's not going to be good, and you will come back eventually to what I'm telling you in October 8th to do, which is an exchange, hostages exchange deal and a ceasefire, and all of these casualties that have gone since, that have, been sacrificed since, would be with us. So if you take that in October 8th, in October 31st, and November, it's still relevant. It's still there, and you can see how, unfortunately, the people that are talking about how we got here are the same people that were saying for a long time that Israelis are not safe. Israelis are not safe, and it's not sustainable, and nobody was listening to them, right? So I do feel like a lot of the chapters are actually prophetic, right? They're written on a certain point, but they're prophetic, and they have insight for taking different choices than what are being taken, and those choices are still there, and we're still taking the wrong choices. So I do think it's still urgent.
Yeah, it's painful to hear that because not to flatter myself, but I mean, I don't think it was I don't think it, demanded any special knowledge to realize that the situation was unsustainable. And I remember that in February 2022, I wrote an article about what could be the potential sparks of the next escalation. And number one on the list was Gaza, because all the conditions were still in place from the previous 5 escalations. So it's very, it is heartrending. I just wonder, would you imagine, so this brings me to my question that I've been asking myself since the first hours of October 7th, and I'm going to ask you, maybe you have an answer. On the first hours, I thought, oh, this is the most horrible thing, and it's going to change everything, but it's actually not going to change anything. And I guess I wonder what you think about that, because I feel like we were just going to see all of the things we've been through before, but much more extreme. And related to that, could you imagine going back to these authors in a year or in 2 years and and the war, and to see if anything has changed in their minds?
That's really, really important. I mean, just starting from the side of going back to authors, I have to tell you, one of the authors, and I won't name who that is, who wrote about hope, told me it's not relevant anymore. I don't have that hope. So I mean, that's very hard to hear, but things have changed. So can you tell me the first part of the question again?
Well, I guess my first part of it was like, has the war changed everything or nothing? I mean, nothing in the sense that we're just doing what we've always done, cycles of violence, each side digging into, in zero-sum positions, occupation continuing and maybe expanding, and people just reinforcing what they already thought. Or do we really think this has changed things in a much more significant way?
So this is where I am naive, because on October 8th, I did think that we know that how we've been dealing with the situation until now is not effective, and it led to this. It led to this catastrophe. So surely we will not be doing the same, since we know what the outcomes are. And I actually, and I'm on record saying that, I said on October 8th, Netanyahu can rise to the moment. I really had hope, or maybe I was begging him, maybe I didn't have. He can rise to the moment and be a leader, right? I said, he released 1,000 prisoners and got Gilad Shalit back. And I genuinely thought with 240 that is a game changer. And the first priority is going to be to try to get them back. And that would give some time for thinking, for strategizing, for thinking about the response, even a military response that is rational and that has and that has an outcome and an end goal. I really thought that there'll be a pause, and the Israelis will come together and will do anything and give any price to bring the hostages back. So I did think it could be a moment of change, and then of course I was proven wrong. And I don't know, Dahlia, I have to tell you, I really don't know, and I don't know where we're going. It could get much worse. There's so many ways in which things can change. They're in front of us. Even the Netanyahu deal that has been advertised now. What Biden announced, this could change things.
I can't decide whether to call it the Netanyahu deal or the Biden deal.
I know. Strategically call it the Netanyahu deal. Can change everything.
Yeah, right,
can start a war and can start a new thinking. The fact that a lot of countries are now moving towards recognizing Palestine as a state, there could be a deal changer if it's no longer Israeli occupying territory, but it's occupying sovereign state. I mean, it could be changes, or it could be more of the same. So unfortunately, I can't tell.
Well, I selfishly want to hear your questions about my book, but I do have one last question. I mean, I have many more questions, but was there any of the essays or insights or even a word choice or language or anything surprise you and say, I never thought of that?
That's really there were so many, like there are actually too many to go over, because this is why I reached out to people who are wiser than me. I think there's a podcast, right? People, women who are wiser than me, people who are wiser than me, and I felt I learned so much from them. I think for me, not a surprise, but the most jolting kind of essay was by my friend Jessica Ossenhaler, who's actually not an academic, but who lost who lost her son, 2-year-old son, when in an accident a few years ago. And she's talking about holding that baby in your hands and the kind of places it can take you.
Yes.
So for her, she doesn't control it, but it takes her to a place where she feels the pain of every mother who loses a child, because she knows what it's like to hold a dead baby in your hand. But at the same time, she said, evolutionarily, biologically, you can't live like that. And she thinks that, and that's why she understands why when you lose your own, the grief is so difficult that you cannot also hold other people's grief, because you will die. You will absolutely die. So she's helping me understand what I don't understand, and that's the lack of empathy. That's been really hard for me to understand. And she, from a place of so much empathy that it's overwhelming and incapacitating, she's explaining to us why it's so hard for people to feel other people's pain when the pain that they have for their own is completely unbearable. So it was helpful for me to have compassion, to have a lot more compassion to the people who are saying horrible things and are doing horrible things, and maybe allowing me to try to listen to them as well and have a compassionate and generous conversation if they're willing to talk to me too.
Yeah, that's a very powerful final note, because I think that is probably the most overriding feeling in the region right now, is that each side going through these things, at least the broader public, has a very hard time. They can think all sorts of opinions about what should happen next, but I think that what really characterizes the vast majority of Israelis, and probably from what we're seeing in surveys, the vast majority of Palestinians, is a very, very difficult obstacle to seeing the other side as a victim or seeing what they've gone through. But I do think the book helps open the pathways for that, so it is a hopeful note.
Thank you so much for the question, Dahlia. And now can we move to talk about your book?
Sure.
Because I think it's more important. I think in a way it might help us in the what we do next, how we go forward, more than my book. My book is really of the moment of war, which I hope the moment of
it's not a competition. I think we need to.
Well, I think my book is of the moment of the war, and I hope that this is a temporary moment. But your book is about the history of democracy in Israel, and that almost the challenges are almost a permanent condition. So I want to ask you first, when did you start working on this book? When did you decide Israeli democracy and the challenges of Israeli democracy was what you want to work on, and what motivated that? And then how long did it take you to write it? And how did you manage to publish it exactly 2023, where the kind of like the crisis of Israeli democracy seemed to have been its absolute peak? So that's my first question.
Well, that is a good question, because I do think it's part of the story of the book itself. In other words, I think every person who writes a book has a story about how he or she decided to do it. But for me, I'm always concerned with democracy, probably anywhere I am, anywhere that I am a citizen. And in Israel, the contradictions were always, sort of on the sleeve of the country. You can't avoid them. And I think it was kind of something that was with me my whole life in Israel since 1997, and even before then. And the occupation was always a big part of that. But what happened in particular was over the last roughly 10 years, but even going as I date the actual beginning to 2007, even before the second Netanyahu government, when I started to see the Attorney General at the time criticizing and trying to pass legislation to constrain the powers of the Supreme Court. And I thought, why is he doing this terrible thing? The Supreme Court is a sacred institution for me. Little did I know that with the next government in the early 2010s under Netanyahu, we would see much more aggressive policies, not only to constrain the Supreme Court, but then eventually branching out to constraining the whole judiciary, but active vitriolic language, openly attacking the Supreme Court, and then eventually attacking other figures within the justice system. And I realized, over the course of the decade, I became increasingly nervous, like really these plans could truly have an impact on the independence of the judiciary that is deeply dangerous. Up until now, I was always trying to point out policies that I thought were dangerous, but now I saw the entire system was going to be transformed in a way that you couldn't even fight against those policies. And so it was something I had been following over the course of, the years, but particularly accelerated, I think, I would say first when there was a justice minister from the Jewish Home Party, Ayelet Shaked, which we forget now because we see that party as looking somehow moderate in the Israeli political system, but she really very much tried to advance these plans. And the rhetoric became angrier and angrier. And I started to wonder, why is there such a constituency who believe that the judiciary is a deep state and stacked, against the people and for the elites and advancing values that the country doesn't want? It can't just be that there's a few people in government who feel that way. There are people in the public who feel that way. And so I was following all of this for a few years. And I think that the tenor really, really reached a fever pitch after Netanyahu himself joined these attacks on the judiciary, which of course happened after he was indicted in late 2019 and in early 2020 when his trials began. By early 2021, I just had an opportunity to write a policy paper. I wanted something more in depth than an article. I wanted to just write about how did the judiciary in Israel, of all institutions, become an enemy of the people? Because I also knew survey research showed for many, many years that the Supreme Court enjoyed among the highest levels of trust of all institutions in Israeli society. I think back in the 2000s, it was like 80% support, and then it was declining. What was happening? And so I began working on a policy paper specifically about the attacks on the Supreme Court, branching out into the judiciary, the attacks on the judiciary. And I realized that it goes back to, 10 years. And then I realized that no, actually, to really understand why some of this resonates with people, you have to go back to the debates of the 1990s, when Israel had what people in society and the legal world call the judicial activism revolution or constitutional revolution, and passed these basic laws guaranteeing human rights, which I always thought was an incredible point of pride. But I didn't realize that they opened up a huge controversy in Israeli life, and many people thought that they were not legitimate. And then I realized that to understand why Israel was in that situation to begin with, of needing these basic laws to guarantee human rights, you had to go back further. Why doesn't Israel have a Bill of Rights or a constitution? And finally, I realized you had to go all the way back to the beginning of the state. And that's where I thought, okay, I've got the whole story about the attack on the judiciary. So I wrote a policy paper in 2021. And by that summer, I started to put more pieces together. And I realized that the story of the judiciary is really just a microcosm or a stand-in for the entire story of the problems with democracy in Israel. And I will say I did change the working title from the crooked timber of Israeli democracy to the crooked timber of democracy in Israel, because the more I went back to the history, the more I think that, by the time I was working on this book, late 2021, early 2022 was when I actually got a contract. I think that the idea for the proposal came together in my mind in late 2021. I realized that the missing pieces, the missing institutional pieces of democracy in Israel were so profound that you actually have a system that appears democratic only if you look at very, very limited measures and very limited number of people who can participate, and people who enjoy the full range of democratic provisions in Israeli society are limited to a subsection of citizens. And there isn't enough institutional basis for people to change that. And so I started to, and especially if you realize that Israel does effectively control, with varying levels and different kinds of regimes, the entire geographic territory, which is part of the premise that I start with. I realized that all the other books about Israeli, trying to tell the full picture of Israeli democracy, right, in the earlier generations and earlier decades, always assumed that we were just talking about Israel within the Green Line or Israeli citizens. And I think that those are outdated, right? The occupation has gone on long enough, whether you support it or oppose it. Israel did effectively, and now even more so, effectively controls the entire region. So when you look at it like that, it made it harder to talk about Israeli democracy, but there are significant elements of democracy, institutions, practices, and traditions of democratic practice in Israel, and we can't ignore those either. That's why I wrote that line, and I have to tell you that the line that Julia cited in the beginning is something that every single person who's read the book notices, because it seemed maybe it's just a good parsimonious way of conveying what I think the contradiction is. The contradiction is that Israel has a sufficient democratic basis, in order to do a lot better than it is. And so I think it was because of the fiery attacks on the judiciary in 2020, 2021, 2022, which to me were, a peak, that made me begin working on the project when I started working on it in earnest in early 2022, I basically finished the first draft by the time, by the end of 2022, after having done a lot of the research over the years. And then I was tortured by editing and fact checking throughout 2023. But ultimately, the book came out in mid-September, just about 3 weeks before the war.
So I do want to ask you one more question, even though I know we're supposed to go to Q&A. We will go to Q&A, but I want to ask you one more question. And that is really about, your book came out at such an opportune time because it's almost like a primer that every person who is now concerned about Israeli democracy, and all of a sudden, a lot of people in Israel realize that there's a problem and there's a crisis. And your book kind of gave the genealogy of that crisis, and also probably the recipes for maybe taking that infrastructure that does exist and making it better and stronger and more democratic. But then the war happens, right? And my question for you is kind of like what you asked me. How is the book? Do you feel like the book is still relevant? Do you think it changed in any way? Your insight changed in any way, or your prescriptions change in any way?
Yeah.
Give what's happening now with because I always thought about. I never thought enough about Gaza, and all of a sudden Gaza is a very important part of this puzzle. I thought about West Bank, I thought about what's happening there, but not enough about Gaza. How is your kind of reading of Israeli democracy and the future of Israeli democracy is affected by the moment we're in?
Yeah, these are tough questions, and I have to say that I was getting this question already during 2023. Because the events were so dramatic, the uprising, the attempt to crush the judiciary, to destroy judicial independence, and the uprising against it had manifest in this, really unprecedented way. I was able to do some editing and tweaking up until June, so I put it in there. But people kept saying, "Did it change your analysis?" And I, without wanting to flatter myself, I didn't think it changed very much. I think the book does set up exactly what the contradictions are, which were probably destined to reach some sort of implosion in terms of Israeli society against itself. I didn't know how it would happen, but I think that you didn't ask that question, but I just want to preface your question by saying that during the course of 2023, it seemed like this was a natural outgrowth of the contradictions and difficulties and missing pieces of democracy that would have to be, somehow fought out, hopefully non-violently on the streets. After the war, part of the problem with answering that question is that we don't yet know how the war will end. Will Israel completely reoccupy Gaza, build new settlements, establish what will effectively be an apartheid regime, which already exists in the West Bank? I don't think there's any dispute about the, general principles that are common to those regimes. And if that's the case, then it's going to be a different analysis, certainly a different prescriptive, even though my book is only partly prescriptive, but it will be more than just missing pieces. It will be actively openly embracing undemocratic policies, calling them basically what they are, and then Israel will cease to be defined as even an aspirational democracy. So that will be a very different situation. If the situation ends with a ceasefire, with like you said, something along the lines of the Biden plan or the Netanyahu plan, whatever we call it, that will ultimately lay the groundwork for an end of Israel's control over Palestinians. Then we can go back to some of the conversations about what is needed for Israel itself, its citizens, wherever they are, whatever their final borders are, to become a true democracy that has the basic. I don't think there's any country that's a perfect democracy. Let me put that out there, but at least that has stronger foundations for the process needed to do better at democratic society. And then the book will remain as relevant as ever. And then the other thing I want to point out is that I think the book remains relevant now because even if the specific legislation that the government has tried to pass in 2023 that made Israelis so nervous and so fearful about the future of democratic institutions, that legislation has been mostly superseded, right? Even the one piece of legislation the government was able to pass was eventually struck down by the Supreme Court. But the government is, kind of typically in wartime, implementing so many deeply undemocratic policies and laws and emergency laws, and these are going to take a long time to undo, even while and while nobody's looking because it's kind of technical and bureaucratic and people don't remember. The government is also reshaping public service with loyalists, which is more important to them than professionals, which is why our Israeli infrastructure and public service wasn't sufficiently prepared. Part of the reason why it wasn't sufficiently prepared. Public services have been gutted over the years, starved of funding, and now stacked with political loyalists. And so those things, the situation is not static. It's not like Israeli democratic, whatever it was on hold during the war. It's being actively undermined during the war. And so I think just getting, no matter what my book actually gets right or wrong, just having a book that says, focus on this problem. It's not going to solve itself. In fact, it's going to collapse if you don't maintain it. Maybe that is its value in itself.
No, I think the book is an absolute essential read. And I recommend everybody here in audience to get it, study it, teach it also. I know I will be teaching it in my classes. I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. So I don't know if Heather is going to tell us what the questions are.
Yes, I am. I'm jumping on here. I could listen to you guys talk about this for so much longer. Thank you. This has been such a great conversation. We have some great questions in the Q&A. The first one, it says, do you feel that there are physical spaces, both locally in Israel and abroad, that welcome people to talk about the issues of picking sides while still being critical about the Israeli-Gaza conflict?
So Dahlia, do you want to address from Israel because you're on the ground?
I'm looking at the question because I have to see it again. Do you feel a physical space but welcome people to talk about the issues of picking sides? Yes. I mean, if the question is physical spaces, sure, we can define those in different ways. I mean, I have in mind, well, let me preface this also. It is increasingly difficult for Israelis and Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel and Jerusalem to meet. It's getting harder and harder, and I know this from personal experience because of my own activities that involve, regular, ongoing, years-long partnerships and cooperation and friendships with Palestinians in all of those places. And one of the very, very bitter realities is that it's very difficult to physically meet right now. I can't, I work with Palestinian partners and we can't actually meet anymore because of the severe, very severe Israeli restrictions on permits and giving Palestinians in the West Bank access to East Jerusalem, which they pretty much don't. So even people who always had access pretty much can't even reach East Jerusalem. For Israelis to go on the West Bank is, it's difficult, it's riskier. You have to either, ideally either go as an individual, but if you're with a group, you have to be careful. And if you're going as an individual, you need to be, I mean, it's not as easy as it once was for groups to sit together. It's a little easier as individuals because each individual can just at least Israelis can go to the West Bank. Palestinians cannot. So for one thing, those are the limitations right now. I mean, I think it's basically a blanket ban other than, very, very few exceptions. And Gaza, needless to say, no Israeli can go and no Palestinian can get into Israel unless they have very, very special, unusual situations. And I think that's almost nil at this point. However, for Israelis and Palestinians who are either citizens or hold, blue IDs or permanent residents of Jerusalem, they can meet each other in certain spaces that are kind of designated for that purpose. So, for example, there is a project of friends and colleagues of mine called Filbet, which is like a physical kind of a community center in Jerusalem, right in the middle of Jerusalem, sort of on the border between pre-67 and post-67 Jerusalem, which is basically run by Israeli and Palestinian leaders in Jerusalem, and it's there for that purpose. Recently, I had a meeting with a group of colleagues at Tantur, which is also just outside Jerusalem, in a kind of seminary that's partly run by Notre Dame University there. And so there are physical locations that are kind of designated for these purposes. But the problem is, I think that there are completely these restrictions are essentially an extreme version of the kinds of movement restrictions that we've had from the West Bank. Certainly in Gaza, much more restrictive all these years. And I think that they are artificial. Why do I say artificial? Because they base the movement restrictions on a unilateral sense of who's the security threat. It's as if there are no Israelis who are a security threat, only Palestinians. And it's a collective designation. It has nothing to do with distinguishing between people who are, what I would consider normal in the sense that they want to live peaceful lives, they want to work and improve their situation, they may want political freedom and self-determination and all those things, but they will not use violence or attack civilians to get it. And those are what I would like to consider mainstream people, and there are plenty of them among both sides who should be allowed to interact, because those kinds of interactions, especially when they're organic, like in Israel's health system, for example, are extremely fruitful, especially because they're not just peace programs, not to dismiss peace programs. But I think that there need to be, it's not so much a matter of whether we have a physical roof or, a room to meet, but more like challenging the entire system of movement restrictions that has always been unilaterally directed at Palestinians, collective limitations, and an artificial sense of who is a threat and who is not. I would refer anybody on this call to my colleague Alberto's work on the permit system on this, because it's really very critical for understanding rather invisible systems of control that, everybody can see the settler hilltops. Not too many people can see the bureaucracy behind this, but it in fact touches many more people.
I would just add to that because of the situation you described, where it is physically difficult to close to impossible, that's one of the reasons why, I wrote an article in the Forward talking about what we can do on college campuses and how we're not doing it. And that is the fact that we do have the physical opportunity and also the freedom to meet and to speak and to come into places where you are able to talk to Israelis and to Palestinians and to people who support Israel and people who support Palestinians, and you can bring them into one room and listen to them talk. But unfortunately, I've seen this, I don't want to say cancel culture, because that has too many connotations, but the idea that different constituencies don't want to hear a speaker that might challenge their positions. And I'm talking about both people who are very supportive of Israel and people who are very supportive of Palestinians. The atmosphere has been one of, I want to only hear people that are going to corroborate and agree and confirm what I already think. Even though you have the opportunity to dialogue. So that's why I'm really looking forward to more dialogue on college campuses and in the United States, because we have the privilege and we have to use it in order to help the people in Palestine and Israel that we care about.
Yeah, that really is very moving to hear. People realize, I sometimes think that people in the US who are choosing not to talk to each other are just not appreciating what they have and not appreciating what it really means to live under oppressive restrictions.
I'm going to jump in here with a couple more questions, and I'm going to jump through the Q&A, jump out of order. Lihi, you kind of just addressed one of the questions in the Q&A. Somebody said, so many months after October 7th and so many months after the war in Gaza, has the atmosphere on campus made it easier or harder for dialogue? I don't know if you want to expand on that anymore, but I know you kind of addressed that a little bit.
That's a great question, because I also think I speak from my own personal experience, and I think everything that you read about what's happening on college campuses is from people beyond my own experience, and my own experience has been my universities and the universities I've been invited to, and I think there is formative. And I think the more and more we create these opportunities for people to witness dialogue, to witness people disagreeing with each other civilly and constructively and productively, the more this space is going to expand and more people are going to be interested in it. So I don't discount it completely, but I do get upset when things get shut down, but whether by administrations or by students. And there are different actors, that it's not just one side shutting the other side, it's everybody trying to shut everybody else. But it hasn't been shut down, and it's still happening, and we just have to get more people on board, I guess. That's my take.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Dahlia, there's a question for you as well. How can the system be fixed if policies have become unchangeable? How can the system be broken into / how can the people make space for themselves within a system that opposes them?
Well, I don't think policies are unchangeable. Policies are policies. It's what's harder to change is the underlying system. So, if the government had been able to implement it, making the entire public service with political loyalists who are incompetent at their professions rather than any professionals, it will be very hard to change and reverse, although not impossible. Policies, I would say, are easier to reverse in some ways. But I think, when it comes to the bigger questions, and I'm just trying to look at, the specific language of that question. But when it comes to the deeper questions about, can any of these things be undone? The challenges to democracy, I think we should, personally, I have a hard time separating Israelis and Palestinians in the region at this point. That there's not really two sides; they're completely interdependent. Our fates are completely intertwined. Right now, there's only one single state governing all of them, essentially with different form, with various types of regimes. So I look at this as a whole, in fact. And I think that if either Israelis or Palestinians in the region are to eventually live under a democratic regime, there will have to be very fundamental changes. And they're not impossible. But I mean, for example, as Lihi knows, we worked together on a fellowship last year where I wrote about comparing constitutions that are designed to recognize the need for national self-determination in ethno-national states, as well as guaranteeing liberal democratic protections and individual rights. Now, getting to a constitution like that seems like a complete fantasy in this region. Like, what kind of Israeli government would ever agree to anything like that? When will Palestinians have, the wherewithal to get a unified representative leadership that can adopt anything like a constitution that guarantees those things? I don't know, but let's just note that it has happened in other countries, and especially in other countries that are post-conflict, and sometimes as a mechanism for ending conflict. And that usually happened in the case, particularly in the case of former Yugoslavian countries and Bosnia, after some of the most violent, vicious bloodletting in the region that shook everybody and the entire world to its core, and made people say we need fundamental change. This isn't a matter of just tweaking and fixing. And so, I think that sounds, even to me, it sounds far-fetched, but I think that right now we have no choice but to look in very far-reaching ways.
That's great. Thank you. I am conscious of time, but I think there's two great questions in the chat still, and I think we have time for one more. This one is short, but I think very powerful. Is this a civil war? Can you guys respond to that?
I just chatted. I just yacked and yacked, so I'm going to let Lihi take this. You have the advantage of some distance, Lihi.
Civil war. I'm wondering if the person is asking whether the conflict in Gaza, the war in Gaza right now is a civil war, or the conflict internal to Israel. So I'm not sure. Like I'm trying to understand the question. Dahlia, do you have a sense of what the person mean? If they mean the war in Gaza or the struggle within Israel about the future of democracy?
No, but I think we should assume. See these as two separate entities? Do you see, the issue of Gaza and the West Bank as something external to Israel, or do you see it as an internal problem? Of course, it's a little bit of both. That's why I would probably look at this as a bit of both. It is a civil war in the sense that Israel's government is the only one that really has sovereign power, even though it's not called sovereignty, but the ultimate authority over the entire area. I guess maybe the person was referring to, among Israeli citizens, which I prefer to say rather than Green Line Israel, because the Green Line, like not a single Israeli could point to it because it doesn't appear on any maps ever. But, and of course, Israelis live, so far beyond the Green Line. But I guess it's probably referring to maybe, Israeli citizen issues. And I think that, it depends on how we define civil war. It's certainly a civil conflict on some level. But in the sense of a breakdown of the monopoly on the use of force, such that there are groups within Israeli society who have, both the access to weapons and the organization to mobilize against another part of Israeli society, not quite. If you look at the entire Israeli-Palestinian issue as a single entity, then there is, technically a civil war. But I guess that's a little far-fetched, really.
Yeah, I would say for the Israel-Palestinian conflict, I don't think any of the actors would see it as a civil war. I don't think Israelis would see it, or Gazans, Palestinians would see it as a civil war.
So only in a very narrow technical.
Yeah. So it's not vocabulary that is used for self-definition. But I have to say, Dahlia, that I'm for the first time am worried about civil war inside Israel, or at least
I didn't say I'm not worried.
Yeah, I think the fissures inside Israel society, which I knew existed, I never realized how deep they are in the sense of the kind of struggle that we see over the fate of the hostages, right? Because I, again, naively thought that the hostages would be one thing that unites Israelis, the worry about their faith and the desire to bring them home. And it's actually not. It actually is divided in Israel to the extent that there are people who are saying, let's sacrifice them, or we don't even care about their fate. And that's something I never thought would happen. And that shows you the fissures and the kind of the rift that is so deep, that the sense of solidarity is so broken, and people are armed to the teeth. At least one side, is armed to the teeth. So the risk is there. It's the first time I'm saying that, but I worry about that. Yeah.
So thank you both.
I think we are about to close the discussion. It's a pity, but so last words from my side. Thank you all for joining us today. It's been a great talk in a dialogical format, and I really wished we had more talks of this kind on the topic. Thanks so much, Lihi. Thanks so much, Dahlia.